So there's two different kinds of factoring in general. One is recourse factoring, the other is non-recourse factoring. Recourse factoring means that the factor can, if they don't get paid by an account debtor, go back to their client and have them purchase the invoice back. Non-recourse factoring just means that the factor buys the invoice and he does not have recourse back to the client and has taken on all of the risk and liability for buying that invoice. So trucking companies, when they hear this, they think, well, of course, I want to be able to sell you an invoice and never have to worry about buying that invoice back if you don't get paid. And so it gets confusing when you look at the contract language that most non-recourse factors use. They'll call it non-recourse factoring, and what they mean by that is in the event of either bankruptcy or insolvency of an account debtor, that they have taken on that risk. And that sounds good, because certainly the carrier doesn't have time to do the credit checks and the collections on somebody that's filing bankruptcy or has gone insolvent. The problem with that is also in that same contract, there's language that says if the factor feels that it is at risk for not receiving payment for an invoice, they have the opportunity to charge it back to the client. So it's really talking out of both sides of their mouths. They're saying it's non-recourse, and if they file bankruptcy or if they're insolvent, then we'll just take the hit on it. But if they feel like someone is heading towards bankruptcy or heading towards insolvency, then they can go ahead and charge that invoice back to a carrier. So it's not really non-recourse factoring, and it gets very confusing, and it makes the factors that call themselves a recourse factor gets us a little frustrated because we're telling the truth to the client. And we are saying that if we are concerned that we're not going to get paid, then we have the opportunity to come back to the client to buy it back. So just as a refresher for what the factoring transaction looks like for a transportation company, you deliver a load and you now have your rate con from the broker. You've got the signed bill of lading now from where you delivered it. And so you submit your paperwork to the factor, and the factor buys that invoice, and you're typically going to have your money that day or the next day, depending on how quickly you choose to receive your funds. And then it's up to the factor to collect. And it takes us typically 30, 35 days in transportation in particular to receive payment. So that's factoring in a nutshell for a trucking company. You haul a load, you get paid for it because you sell the invoice to us. The difference between then recourse factoring and non-recourse factoring is really on the back end. If you ever get to the 90 days and it hasn't paid, again with non-recourse, if they file bankruptcy or that they're insolvent, then they're saying that they're going to take the hit. You would think that a recourse factor like private commercial finance would just go ahead and buy every invoice that we could, because we know at the end of the day, the trucking company has to buy it back from us. Well, let's think about that for a minute. What good am I to a trucking company if I don't tell you on the front end whether or not I think you're going to get paid? That's not helpful to anybody. By the time I figure out that an invoice isn't going to get paid, if I've just bought everything that a trucking company has sold to me, I don't know that the trucking company has the funds to buy that invoice back. I don't know that they're going to continue to haul loads to be able to pay me back. So what I do, and what private commercial finance does, is we do a lot of credit checking on the front end. We have our clients through our portal will come in and say, I want to haul for this broker. We'll go in and do a credit check on them. We'll look at different credit reporting agencies, set a credit limit for them, and tell the carrier, okay, you can haul up to $5,000 worth of loads for this particular broker. The less fun answer is when we say, no, we're not going to buy any invoices if from that particular broker. Less fun because the carrier typically has a load that they want to haul, and then they find out, oh, well, my factoring company isn't going to buy it from me. Some factoring companies will not let you haul that load. Provident in particular says, hey, we're not going to buy it, but we're not going to tell you, Mr. Business Owner, what you can and can't do. If you still want to haul the load for them, that's fine. You go ahead and do it. It's just not one that we're going to buy. We frown on that because our expertise and what the value that we add and what we bring to the table is knowing whether or not you ought to haul a load for somebody and whether or not you're going to get paid. But again, they're the business owner. We're not going to tell them what they can and can't do, just what we will and won't do. On there's some differences between the two that we've already talked about, but we'll also, there's three in particular that I think help to sort of quantify and say, all right, these are the three big differences between the two types of factoring. One is liability. We said earlier that a non-recourse factor is telling its clients that they're going to take on all the liability for being paid, that they've done the credit checks, they like the broker, they think that they're going to get paid. And so if we buy the invoice, it's ours. On a non-recourse a recourse factor then is one who's going to say, at the end of the day, if we can't get paid, Mr. Carrier, Miss Carrier, you're going to have to buy it back from us. But we spend a tremendous amount of time on the front end doing the credit checks and the collections to try to keep that from happening. So if a non-recourse factor truly does what they say they're going to do, it's a good deal. And a trucking company, if they can, just from a pure liability perspective, if a trucking company can get a non-recourse factor to buy their invoices, yeah, that's a great way to go. But the next big difference then is going to be the cost for both a recourse and a non-recourse factor. A recourse factor typically charges less than a non-recourse factor because we do have a shared liability there. We recognize that the carrier at the end of the day is responsible for payment to the factoring company for that invoice. And so we don't charge as much because we don't take on that kind of liability. The non-recourse factor typically is more expensive than a recourse factor because they're telling you that they're taking on that liability. But here's the part that is a little frustrating for a recourse factor that shows up and is transparent and says, this is what we're going to do, this is how much we charge, and this is how we're going to work to get it paid, is the non-recourse factor is charging more for a factoring arrangement and a contract that isn't in reality any better than a recourse factor's contract. Because at the end of the day, if they know that they're going to bankruptcy and they know that they're going to be insolvent, and they've got the language in the contract that says that if we're at risk of not being paid, we can charge this invoice back to you, it's a bait and switch. And that's very, very frustrating for a lot of people. So the next piece about that too is if you think about some of the brokers that are out there, you've got these huge ones like C.H. Robinson or TQL or J.B. Hunt, folks that you really are not worried about paying on an invoice. The reason they wouldn't pay on an invoice is if it got invoiced incorrectly, or paperwork didn't look good, or there was a lumper receipt that was thrown in that they hadn't agreed to. So it's not a credit issue that if it's a load that was hauled that was supposed to be hauled and you bill it correctly, you get paid. Well, the non-recourse factor then is charging you a higher rate on a particular company that you don't need that kind of protection with. And so the recourse factor, on the other hand, doesn't charge you for the credit risk on the larger brokers, again, because we've got that recourse piece at the tail end. So you end up paying for coverage on companies that you don't need that kind of coverage and assurance on, because they're sort of the titans of the industry, and they're going to pay. So cost is the next big difference between the two. And then the third is going to be requirements. Typically, a recourse factor, we will be more willing to listen to both our carriers and some of the newer brokers that maybe the credit reporting agencies um, haven't shown that they've got a lot of track record, or they don't have any track record. We'll actually send a credit application to a broker because it may very well be that the reporting agencies um, don't have all of the data on that particular broker. And so if they've got references that a recourse factor can look at and show that they've got credit limits and credit that's been extended to them by folks that aren't reporting to the agencies, well, then we've got a better idea on what their credit worthiness is really like. So we'll spend more time trying to find a way to get them credit approved. Non-recourse folks, typically, unless it is fairly, and I'm going to say ironclad, um, they're going to be typically more strict on who they will approve um, for a trucker to be able to haul for. So the next thing that you, and this is not true for all recourse factors, but it is true of Provident in particular. Um, Typically, a non-recourse factor is going to have a contract that's going to lock people in for at least 12 months, sometimes longer than that. And they'll also have an early termination fee. So if you're trying to leave and go somewhere else, they're actually going to charge you money to get out of the contract. Nice thing about Provident is we've got what we call a no-term contract, which basically means if you've got a zero balance with us, you can go anywhere else you want to. So in doing it that way, it's sort of what we've tried to do is build a company for the trucker that says we're going to do credit checks on the front end. We're going to do everything we can to collect on all the invoices that we buy from you. We're not just going to leave you hanging and buy every invoice that you try to sell to us, whether it's credit worthy or not, because we know you're going to have to buy it back from us at some point. Um, So by building the company the way we have, if we don't take care of a carrier like we're supposed to, they can go anywhere they want to. They can go to another factor. They can buy us out, and we don't charge them to leave because we feel like if we don't take care of them and they want to go somewhere else, it's a little disingenuous on our part to get upset that we didn't do what we said we were going to do, and then charge them to leave. It just makes no sense. So that's another thing that you'll find in particular with Provident. Um, and we're a recourse factor, but we're upfront about that and want to make sure that our carriers know that just because someone else says to them that it's non-recourse factoring, let us help you navigate that and look at the contract language before you sign anything, because it there's very few true non-recourse factors that are out there, especially in the transportation space.